This is FRM Part 2, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, and the chapter on range of practices and issues in economic capital frameworks. Two quick points I want to make before we get to the learning objectives here. Notice that in the title of the chapter is the term economic capital. We've talked about risk capital, we've talked about regulatory capital, and we've talked about economic capital. So we're going to continue along those lines in studying economic capital. But note, the source of this chapter is the Basel Committee. And so one of the concerns that you should have as reading this chapter is that it's pretty lengthy, but we need to make sure that we focus on those learning objectives and extract the important parts of this chapter from those learning objectives as it applies to future exam questions. Now, the partial good news is that there are just 4 learning objectives here, but if you note, in each of those learning objectives, the term economic capital is contained in it. And so we're going to describe challenges. Boy, we've done that in a bunch of recent chapters. Recommendations, benefits, and then, of course, we'll end with best practices, which is what we've been doing lately. So let's go ahead and get right into kind of a definition of an economic capital framework. So look at our illustration there. We've got economic capital in the middle, and then circularly, we've got a couple of things that are mentioned in the learning objectives. So there are several different processes that we're going to have to consider. And these are not unfamiliar to us. Let's go ahead and start at the top and work our way around the right. So calculating risk measures. Of course, we've spent lots of time quantifying risk. And we've spent a good amount of time talking about how to aggregate risk. The simplest of all ways to do this is to take the standard deviation of one asset and the standard deviation of another asset and see what happens when you aggregate those two assets or combine them. Of course, calculating risk and aggregating risk involves some kind of a reliance on a model. And so we need to make certain that the models that we're using, I've used this example in recorded videos in the past. Suppose we're trying to measure the risk in a financial institution by going outside and counting the number of clouds in the sky. That doesn't make any sense at all. So we need to make sure that the model has sound underlying economic assumptions. We had multiple chapters on counterparty risk, so we'll talk about that just a little bit again. One of my favorite risks to evaluate is interest rate risk, so we'll do a little bit of that. And then at the end, we're going to say, all right, we've done all this stuff. Now let's go back and make sure that the model worked the way we thought it was going to work. We'll call that model validation. All right, so here's a good illustration about the framework of economic capital. So what was that top one back there? Let me swing back here. Calculating risk measures. All right, what are desirable properties of a risk measure? Intuitive. I guess that makes perfect sense, right? So there should be some relationship between and among uncertainty and ranges and risk levels and shortfalls and losses and unexpected losses and prices and returns, right? So this should make perfectly sound economic sense. Stable, this is important. So we're relying on a model. And as I say to you guys regularly, just think of a model as some big old Excel spreadsheet. And we have all of these input variables. If we change one of those variables and then we rely on the parameters from our model and we get some huge result as a change in the output, then that model is probably not too stable. Coherent risk measures ought to be coherent. These 4 axioms. Let me go ahead and just give you my little definition for all of these 4. I'm guessing you remember this from a previous discussion, but monotonicity, that those of you who are mathematically inclined should love that part. Take derivatives, see if the first derivative is positive or negative. But I like to think of it in maybe kind of two different senses. The classic economic example here is that if I went to the farmer's market, I love doing this on Fridays and Saturdays. I go down, and if I bought a bag of 10 peaches and 10 strawberries and 10 cherries, and I said, hey, look at this beautiful array of fruit. We're going to have a great lunch. But then if I said to you, hey, I want you to pick between 10, 10, and 10, but I'm going to also give you a choice between 10 peaches and 10 strawberries and 11 cherries. Of course, which one are you going to pick? So you're going to pick the second group because more is better than fewer, right? So that's the economics definition. From a financial perspective, let's suppose instead of fruit, let's suppose that I turn them into dollars. So if I said, hey, there are two financial securities out there. One pays you 10, 10, and 10 over the next 3 years, let's say, and another one pays you 10, 10, and 11 over the next 3 years. Well, then what's going to happen? Then, of course, the second group is going to sell for the higher price and therefore ought to have lower risk. Positive homogeneity, that's a simple one. That just means that if you have this much risk with this position and you double your position, like maybe invest $200 as opposed to $100, then you ought to double your risk. Subadditivity, that's one of those words that those two parts of that word just don't seem to go together for me. Subadditivity. I mean, when you do 1 + 1 = 2, that's adding, right? And you can't really argue with that. Sub means below adding. I'm not really sure what that means, but what it tells you is that if you have the risk of one asset and you have the risk of another asset, and if you combine those together, you're going to get less risk. So subadditivity is actually a pretty good term to describe the elements of diversification, which rely, of course, entirely on correlation, coefficient, and covariance. So the only way that if you add this risk and you add the second risk and they sum to the two individual risks is if it's a positive 1.0 correlation coefficient. And then translation invariance simply means that when you add cash to any kind of a portfolio, then the risk has to fall. Was that worth 3 or 4 minutes of your time, me going through my examples? I don't know. All right, easy to compute, easy to understand. We like all that kind of stuff, right? Simple and meaningful. Now, we should be used to talking about challenges, and these are really the cool things that I think about when faced with making decisions. Our students at my school, they're constantly asked to do a SWOT analysis in all their business classes: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so, these challenges here kind of combine a couple of those elements. We've spent a good amount of time talking about the pros and cons of value at risk. The important thing for you guys to remember, probably for an exam question, is that it is incoherent because it is not subadditive. But there are other problems as well. Remember, this value at risk answers the question, okay, what happens in the worst case scenario at some level of confidence, like 90% or 95% or 99%. So we're examining that left tail, low probability event, but substantial losses. And so value at risk, it might tell us something about the minimum value of some kind of a loss, but it doesn't really tell us anything to the left of it, right? So if we assume a normal distribution, then here, let me just draw that left hand so we get tinier and tinier and tinier as we go out there. But who knows what that left tail distribution looks like? Look at that second block point. It is not stable, heavily influenced by the underlying set of assumptions. Now, remember all those weaknesses at value at risk. Then we decided that, well, let's go ahead and look at those values to the left of that confidence level, and let's go ahead and take their average. So we call that an expected shortfall. Expected shortfall is actually coherent, but it really is incapable of ranking these assets or the model's performance based on any kind of an interesting or an intuitive scoring function. And I think sometimes it's not only not easy to interpret, but can be really difficult to interpret. Standard deviation, we love this measure of risk. This goes all the way back to Harry Markowitz in 1952, and probably way before that time as well. But standard deviation is a universally accepted measure of risk. All different sorts of fields use it, science and engineering, not to mention those of us in economics and finance. But this is one thing that I do know from working on my dissertation. It is not stable. Of course, it depends on lots of different things. When I calculated standard deviations and betas, they changed if I used this much of historical data versus this much of historical data. And one of the big problems is that second bullet point. It's not really forward-looking. That's why. Remember, standard deviation is one critical input in the Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing model. And if you knew what the standard deviation of, let's say, a well-known stock like Amazon was going to be over the next month, if you were somehow super smart and you could predict that with 100% accuracy, you could be a billionaire, maybe even a trillionaire by the end of the month, because that's what people are betting on in the options market. And so if you use the historical standard deviation, you're really going to be behind the game. Now, spectral risk measures are coherent measures that add two extra properties. One of them is called law invariance, and another one is called comonotonic. Can be complex and difficult to understand and are actually not used very widely, and they're not stable. All right, let's get back to that concept of aggregating risk. So the process of combining risk data. Now, what does that mean? So we have all these different risks, right? We have operational risks, we have interest rate risk, we have business risk, we have all these different kinds of risks, right? So we want to group those into some integrated risk profile. So we've got these business units, and we've got the chief risk officer who is collecting all of this risk data for each one of these different kinds of risks and then trying to determine whether they are related at all. So we're going to compute covariances and correlation coefficients and copulas, and we're going to try to make certain that we can aggregate these risks so that we can price the risks and then allocate resources efficiently into each one of those business units. Now, this is challenging in many, many different ways, but what this chapter focuses on are a couple of things here: technical and conceptual difficulty. So look at that first circle point. Most banks rely heavily on ad hoc solutions and judgments. All right, so what does this mean? Ad hoc solution and judgments. This brings in the specter of making decisions based on emotions and based on faulty brain process. In behavioral finance, we call these emotional biases and cognitive errors. And so if we're allowing biases to creep into our individual risk assessment, then that umbrella allocation, it can't be efficient and it can't even be effective. And it's probably going to cause substantial problems and losses. Now look at that second circle point there. This one sounds crazy, but you may assume that no diversification effects exist at all when in fact it's been shown that there are at least some diversification benefits, because there's really hardly ever a scenario where there's perfect correlation out there, either positive or negative. Yeah, there we go. Subjective expert judgment. Now, what this typically results in is that we tend to underestimate the overall risk, even under conditions in which assumptions may or may not be realistic. And of course, one of the big challenges, and I learned this back in graduate school, when you try to figure out how to annualize returns, which is relatively easy, and then annualize standard deviation, and you use the square root rule, and sometimes the square root rule is appropriate, and sometimes it's not. Now we have these models. These models are giving us some output. We're then aggregating the risk and then using that to allocate resources. So then we need to go back and say, all right, how did we do? This is the loop that ties all the processes back in to the original step or that next step. So we need to validate the model. So notice what we have in that first block point. Validation is the proof that a model works as intended. Now, proof, of course, we put in the asterisk because, the quotation marks, because proof from a calculus standpoint typically means, okay, 1 + 1 = 2, and you can prove that. Proof here doesn't necessarily mean calculus and mathematical proof, but validating means, you know what, here's our model, and we're doing everything we can to make sure it works, and then to the best of our knowledge, it has worked the way that we intended it to, but it's a work in progress, so that we're going to improve the model over time. So let me just quickly read those first couple of block points there to you. All right, the model working as they should, single out and omit any unrealistic assumptions. And then, of course, the more accurate the model becomes, the more you can validate the model, then it increases confidence levels. All right, so those challenges down there, still a work in progress, provides evidence for all that of these desirable properties, that there's really no technique that's going to ensure or prove that this model is working perfectly. Yeah, look at the last one down there. Some performance imbalance. Now, how about dependency modeling in credit risk? Wow, this is really interesting stuff. When we have multiple third parties out there, what would be really good is if we knew not only that they were going to default on this trade, but they're going to default on multiple trades simultaneously. And so this is an important part of modeling, is how we can determine which of those people that are on the other side of their transaction, whatever that transaction is, whether it's just a simple deposit into our financial institution or some complex credit default obligation, right? Look at the circle point. The more correlated the obligors, the more extended is the tail, that left-handed tail, value at risk and expected loss. Now, what that means, of course, in the end is that, if you have this perfectly normal distribution on that left tail, you can kind of get a sense of, all right, I need this much economic capital. But if that left tail goes like this, and then up and down and up and down and up and down, wow, then how much economic capital does the firm need? So not only is this important in allocating resources to each individual business unit, this is extremely critical in determining the amount of economic capital that is needed, so that the bank knows that under these worst case scenarios that it can remain solvent. All right, how about challenges in this area? No significant advancement in methodologies over the past decade or so. Now, this sounds to me, as a good academic, this sounds to me like this is an invitation for me to come up with a model so that I can win a Nobel Prize or some other kind of prize in economics. But of course, I'm probably not smart enough to do that all on my own. However, there are lots and lots of smart professionals and academics who are working on this right now. Uphill task, particularly during times of stress. And if we're gonna identify these times of stress as a once in a lifetime event, remember in a previous chapter we talked about an event being a once in every 1,000 years. boy, that's a difficult one to model once every 1,000 years. So these challenges are substantial. But remember, as really, really smart financial risk managers, it's our job to aggregate all of this stuff, know the strengths, know the weaknesses, know the opportunities, and know the threats. There's that SWOT analysis that our students do all the time. How about counterparty risk? You know, we've talked about this regularly. Let me lean up and get my financial calculator. I'll go ahead and do this example once again. Let me just remind you, suppose you and I agree to trade that HP calculator for $100, you know, in 3 or 6 months' time. So we have a forward contract. Well, I have counterparty risk and you have counterparty risk. And so the challenges are market risk related challenges. I mean, this has everything to do with the price of this financial calculator, right? If at the end of 3 or 6 months that calculator sells for $1,000, well, what are you going to do? You're going to run to my door and say, "Hey, Jim, here's $100. Let me have that calculator," and you're going to go out and sell it. But you might not be able to find me because I may have gone out and sold it for $100 so that I can get that $900, and then I'll just worry about dealing with you when you show up at my door. On the other hand, if the price of that calculator is just $1, I'm going to be waiting for you to come to pay me that $100. So market risk, you know, these prices, they go way up and they go way down. Credit risk is related to all of the other stuff that I do and all of the other stuff that you do. Maybe I have this one financial calculator, but I may have thousands of other forward contracts and futures contracts and swap contracts based on all different other sorts of kinds of assets, including alternative investments. And if I'm doing really poorly on all those, I may not show up when it comes time to settle our contract. So credit. And then wrong way risk, we've talked about this in the past. This occurs when the probability of default and the loss given the default rise at the same time. And this is almost impossible to identify and quantify, but that doesn't mean that we can't try. And then, of course, some contracts have margin requirements and some don't. Now, how about interest rate risk? You know, this has been fascinating me since I had my very first class in my master's degree. I have an MS in finance. I don't have an MBA, but I had it was actually an economics class. I had a really cool professor who told us all about interest rates, from the simplest economic concept of an interest rate, just, you know, trading apples for pears in a real simple economic environment, all the way up to complex derivative securities. And so I'm fascinated by, you know, interest rate movements, which, you know, go up and go down, and everything that goes inside of that basket of determining interest rate risk. And then, of course, what's relevant for us is how do we model that interest rate risk? And, you know, one of the ways that we do this is by putting together some interest rate tree. And with securities that are option free, you know, you can pretty much model that all the way out here. Think of an Excel spreadsheet. You know, if interest rates go up or if interest rates go down, you can take the present value of those possible let's say bond prices in the future based on certain interest rates, and then you can calculate the price. But what gets fascinating is when that underlying security has some kind of an embedded option, you know, like a callable bond. Well, then that interest rate tree gets really, really interesting, because when interest rates fall below some certain point, then the price of that bond is going to be its par value. It's never going to sell at anything other than its par value. So these models of interest rate risk have to include consideration for that embedded option. Two just quick examples here: consumer loans that allow for early prepayment. A personal example: my daughter and her husband just are in the process of refinancing their mortgage. So they take their mortgage at their 4.75% interest rate, and they're going to borrow from somebody else at 3.25% interest rate and pay off that other loan. So there's an embedded option in there. And in addition, I can use my debit card anytime to access my checking account, right? I don't even know if we call it a checking account anymore. Anybody even write checks? How about recommendations for internal risk measures by this Bank for International Settlements? So here's 10 of these recommendations. And I'm guessing that if you came up with 10 of these on your own without reading from any of these authoritative or governing bodies, you would probably come up with probably 7 or 8 of these just on your own. I'm going to go ahead and start with number 2 because I like number 2. We've talked about number 2. Senior management and the board should set the tone at the top for providing guidelines for managing these internal risk measures. All right. So, of course, when you're thinking about the bottom right-hand side of a financial institution's balance sheet, you got to talk about capital adequacy. So these economic capital models that we've discussed in previous chapters ought to be used. So we need to document, we need to identify the risks. Oh, look at 5. Understand that all risk measures have their strong and weak points. That's your homework assignment. I'm going to say to you guys, go home and do a SWOT analysis in your own life and then in your professional life, right? Strong and weak points. So I want to take it a step further by, SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's even more comprehensive than just that number 5. Accuracy, quality of the measurement of the individual risk component. So of course, when I walk into my financial institution and I say, okay, I want to open up a certificate of deposit, here's $10,000. Well, that bank has to make some kind of an assessment about my risk, and I have to make some kind of an assessment about that individual risk. You can't have any internal risk measure description without the word rigor and comprehensive in it. Pay attention to the level of dependency embedded in a portfolio credit risk model. So what are we depending on? Are we depending on central bank behavior for an interest rate risk model, or are we depending on the number of clouds in the sky? Integrated stress testing, of course. And then there's 10, examine any instrument with embedded options. And in fact, many financial securities have embedded options. Some are more obvious than others. All right, how about that learning objective describing the benefits and impacts of using an economic capital framework? All right, benefits. Incremental risk contribution. I learned this even back in my undergraduate days as an accounting major, is that when you're evaluating a project, you need to evaluate the incremental cash flows. And so that my accounting professors and finance professors, they all said, this is why we make you take economics, so you understand, marginal utility and marginal rate of transformation and all that kind of stuff. So marginal and incremental, they can be kind of interchanged. But here, we're being more specific about incremental risk contribution. And so you have this portfolio. Let's suppose we have this portfolio of 100 loans that are made locally to businesses, and they range from, let's say $250,000 to $1 million. And then we have some business owner comes in and says, I need $623,000 because I want to expand my business. Well, we need to make certain that we know exactly how much risk that particular new potential borrower has, and then how it relates to the overall concentration of the loan portfolio. Of course, look under the constraints heading there. The credit quality of each borrower is determined in the context of the portfolio. So what we do is, of course, the first step is to compute that standalone risk, but that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is, how does it fit in to the rest of the portfolio? And that's the major part of the portfolio, but you can't do that unless you do the standalone measure as well. All right, so we just did credit portfolio management, so let's do risk-based pricing. This is one of my favorite topics. I've said this to my students for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. The important thing is to identify the risks and then quantify the risks. And you quantify the risks so that you can accurately price financial security. And so look at that block point there. Banks can make strategic decisions that maximize long-term profitability, of course. So strategic decisions means that we're going to allocate capital to those business units based on our ability to price those individual risks and how they relate to the entire contents of the portfolio. Now, I believe it was that last chapter that we spent some good time calculating and computing the risk-adjusted return on capital, which, of course, let me just remind you quickly, was just a different way of saying we want to invest in projects that have positive net present values, which means that we're going to have to reject some projects that have negative net present values. How about customer and product profitability analysis? So we've got this economic capital, right? If we need an economic capital, let me just pick a number. Say it's 10. And let's suppose for some reason we just have 14 in economic capital. Well, that, of course, is not efficient. So let's go back to our Harry Markowitz efficient frontier from 1952. So what this economic capital does, it allows us to move on this efficient frontier, so to speak. Now, remember, Harry Markowitz was giving us his ideas in the framework of a stock portfolio. But it applies, of course, to economic capital in allocating resources to different business units. All right, look at that second block point. If the bank is able to overcome measurement obstacles, which is what we're trying to do here, it should be in a position to profile customer segments, right, on their basis of profitability, better allocation. All right, so that's what I've been talking about over these last few slides. All right, so what are some constraints here? More complicated analysis, but look, this is what we're training to do here, right? We love complications. We don't want to have our boss come to us and say, hey, Jim, I need you to go over here and add 1 + 1 = 2 and take the whole day to do it. We don't want that. We want challenges. We want to say, man, let's scratch our heads. Let's figure out how to do this so that we can reach a consensus on how to solve this problem, how to allocate resource. All right, so, but the problem then is, boy, if we've got somebody doing it over here and somebody doing it over here, someone over here, so what does it say? May result in more workload for the staff. Now, we've been ending with best practices. So best practices go back, all the way to the 1980s or so. Active involvement of senior management. Boy, if you ever get a choice, A, B, C, or D on an exam, just pick active involvement of senior management, regardless of what the question is. Of course, I'm being facetious there, but that's really important. Let's see, centralized economic capital function. So what's happening is that we have, some kind of framework in which we've got a centralized unit who's making these decisions, or a decentralized process where each of those business unit managers determines the efficient allocation of capital. My personal belief that one or both of these, are kind of mutually exclusive or competing. Banks should measure economic capital and conduct assessment tests regularly. This is what we're born to do, right? Economic capital. We've talked about this for several chapters, how critical it is for the success of a financial institution. And so we should be dying to do this. I mean, of course, doing it every day is too much. Monthly or quarterly, I would be on top of this and say, let's do this whenever we can, whenever we get a chance, let's go ahead and do this. And then, of course, look at that last block point that we've written down there. Formal policies and procedures and risk culture. Let me go back to that word. And general firm culture, validation, all that kind of good stuff. Now, hopefully I've convinced you of the importance of this economic capital framework. Notice that first block point up there. Most banks apply stress tests to individual risks, but the practice is not widespread enough. Economic capital should not be the sole determinant of required capital. And so remember, I think it was just in that previous chapter, we talked about not only the shareholder needs, but we talked about other stakeholder needs. And so we need to consider all the different people who show up on the right-hand side of the balance sheet and the left-hand side of the balance sheet. And this is difficult because different banks can define capital in different ways. Let me go ahead and read that bottom one to you. Economic capital models result and the results need to be transparent and taken seriously. So that taken seriously part, that swings all the way back to the board and the senior leadership team. And that takes us through those 4 learning objectives. Let me just remind you, economic capital is in each one of those. So I'm going to say, let's go ahead and know economic capital as it relates to each one of those learning objectives. Because if I'm writing exam questions, those are 4 really, really good questions.